going on, guys? Welcome back to RC Everyday. This is a video that I've been wanting to make for years. We're going to put together my RC rat rod kit today, and this is going to be the instructions step by step. We've got a parts list. I'm not sure yet how I've shared that. Maybe in the video, maybe in the description below. List all the hardware and everything you need to do this. And yeah, we're going to go piece by piece, put this thing together, and talk about some of the options and everything that you have with this kit, and go from there. So let's get started. All right, guys, so to start off with, the chassis kits include 2 rails, 2 rear cross members, our R4 trans plate and mounting piece, and our grill, which is a shock mount, servo mount, and it has a radiator inside of it. All this stuff is SLS printed. It's nylon infused. We can sit out in the sun. Won't warp like your regular 3D printing stuff will. It is all threaded. So you thread the screws into it. Fine thread, coarse thread will work either way. I recommend do not use power tools. I'm going to use power tools unless you have a lot of skill with it. You've been doing it for a while. I worked for 10 years in a factory using Makitas. I got good trigger discipline. You can strip these out and it will ruin them. So the disclaimer out of the way. The first thing we're going to do is mount the servo. So our servo mounts, you can see these protrusions in the front and they mount from the back. So that gives a place for the screw to thread. So I've got a list below of the hardware we're going to use. These are going to be 2.5 mil hardware. So again, I recommend using a hand tool for this. I'm going to use this because I've been out here taking this apart and putting it back together all day, and I'm tired of hand cranking. So we got M2.5 by 6, 4 screws to mount the servo. So again, this is all we're offering with the kit right now to keep the price down. I can't produce 1,000 or 10,000 units of this. I can't afford it. It would cost me $1 million to offer axles, tires, wheels, gearbox, motor, everything all in one. So we're trying to keep the cost down for you guys. Yeah, it is what it is. So use a micro servo. I've got a Reefs Micro 99. This is what I recommend. It doesn't have to be this, but anything this size. This servo has 99 ounces of torque, and that is good because this is a 10th scale. These are typically designed for, 24 scale or other things like that. And I've used these on rat rods before. It has plenty of power to turn the tires. Being 1/10 scale, you could use a cheap, you could throw a little $6 Amazon servo in here. It would work. It wouldn't be the fastest. It wouldn't be the quickest. This works well. These are good and quiet. They're efficient. And it's a good place to spend extra money if you're going to actually drive this thing around. So flip it over right here. Servo fits in nice and snug. It'll actually stay in place while you put the screws in. These screws actually still have a, what is this, a 2.5 or 2.0? Let me double check for you. These actually have a 2.0 head, so they're going to be easy to run in. Most everything on this kit is going to be a 3 mil, except for where the R4 transmission mounts to the trans plate, and the servo mounts to this. Because these servos are designed to work with smaller hardware, we didn't really have an option to get around that, short of making our own servo. 6 mil is good. It doesn't stick out. There's still probably 2 or 3 millimeters in the threaded area. We left a lot of space there. Most of this, what I recommend for the hardware size is an in-between. It could be a little shorter. It could be a little bit longer. But again, you don't want to strip out the plastic, because we are not a big company and we don't offer a warranty on our stuff. So, and I say we, I mean me, because I'm by myself. So, servo is installed. I've got a nice little billet servo horn here. Nice Reefs. A couple issues with that. The micro servos have a smaller hardware thread. I believe it is a 2.5. Let me test one. It actually may be a 2 mil. So what I typically do, because I'm going to mount this to 3 mil rods, I'm going to drill one of these holes out, usually the top one because this is a pretty short horn, and go from there. I have the plastic horns that came with the servo. You could do that, it'd be easier, but it doesn't look as good because it's white plastic and it just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. There may be some servo horns on the market that will fit the micro servos that have standard M3 holes. I don't know of any, but that's again up to you to do with your build. You can see there, we've got plenty of space for the servo to move completely back and forth without hitting any of this. And it is good and mounted. I'm not going to put that in because I have to take the servo out again later. So we're going to rock it like that. It's mounted, and we're going to move on to the next step. With this kit, there's a lot of versatility. So the chassis are steel. They are bendable. They will bend. You could break them if you bend them too much. It's mild steel. You can weld to it. You can do whatever you want to it. Our motor plate is, again, SLS printed, nylon infused, super durable. We designed this to fit around the R4 transmission, the RC four-wheel drive TCI transmission, and everything works and jives nice with that. These plates here are larger because that gives you a place to mount it, your screws to go through the chassis and actually thread into something. And this is going to be your front suspension mounts, but we'll get to that in a minute. So our motor plate, standard stuff, your R4 gears go in here, your motor bolts to it from the back. There's a little bit of wiggle room just to make sure you can get the mesh nice and tight where you want it. So I've got one over here already put together. You can see how that all works. Your R4 transmission goes into that. We've got a perfect mesh set up on this one already. And yeah, it's ready to bolt in. I'm gonna leave this piece out. Bearing fits nice and snug in there. So the way I like to do this, we're gonna go ahead and put our gear in. Got the wrong one. Make sure that all jives good and nice. We're gonna go ahead and bolt our transmission to the plate. See, it all lines up good. I'm gonna thread these into the motor plate. So as you can see here, we started with the bottom two. These thread straight from the transmission and they thread into our block here. The other ones, these four here on the sides, are gonna go to our scale motor. Now, this is where there's a lot of options available. So I'm using the SSD scale motor. This came with their Trail Walker truck. This is a very cheap scale engine. It looks very good. That's what I put in my 3-window rat rod, painted and stuff. It looks fantastic. It's got not a lot of aftermarket options for it yet. We're going to be working on some stuff for that as well. But 3D printed options and things are available. The only thing you have to worry about is the clearance down here. So I've got a 3D printed flathead that I've used before, and the starter hits this. I've got a resin cast 350 small block that someone gave me, and it has some stuff that'll get in the way. So you may have to modify your engine to fit this. If you're running the RC four-wheel drive scale V8, you do not need to use this plate at all. The motor will bolt directly to the transmission. It has its own mounting points, and you will have to drill holes in your chassis rail accordingly. That may be something we add later in the kit, but trying to keep the cost down, trying to keep it reasonable. I mean, we're already spending $80 on a transmission, give or take. So another $180 on a motor seemed kind of out of the question for me. So 3D printed options. I know we're going to offer some stuff here in the future, but right now this is what it's designed around. This and 3D printed options. Most of my 3D printed motors I've used on setups like this, where I use the RC four-wheel drive plate or the SSD plate and things like that. I actually drilled holes in the print and put set screws in it just to kind of clamp it to the motor, and it set just fine. My farm truck rat rod is that way. That flathead V8 I've got, it just slides over, wires stick through a hole, and I put some set screws in it to lock it in place. We've left a little bit of extra space on the end of the chassis, so the motor sets about ½ inch away from the grill, in case you wanted to run like a Cummins 3D printed engine or anything like along that nature, a straight 6, straight 8, something like that. You've got a little space to work with, and yeah, with it like this, there's room to run hoses to our fake radiator inside of the grill. We've got a mount there and a mount there. If you use the RC four-wheel drive radiator kit, it has the hoses and the hose clamps, and they will fit right over that and fit perfectly. So next I'm going to put the 4 screws in here to hold our engine to our transmission. Just these 4 here. The other screws, the top 3, are going to be a little bit shorter than this, but those are hardware that come with the R4 transmission. So I don't know exactly what size those are. But again, you're threading into plastic. Even though that is commercially produced plastic, it is still strip-outable. Strip-outable. Make a new word. Gotta know when to let off. So that's all we're gonna put in on this one, because again, I have to take this thing apart a million more times since this is the prototype, and it's gonna be the test mule for any new parts we come out with in the future. So Now we got that on here, we're going to move to our rear mount. And this is designed to fit perfectly with the chassis. Again, another hardware is M3 by 8mm. That is kind of generic. Everybody's got a drawer full of those somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and put these two in here. It is not threaded into the plastic, but it does thread into your R4 transmission and fits perfectly where it needs to go. All right, so now that is all ready to go into the chassis. So at this point, it doesn't matter which cross members you put in first. I'm going to start here on the back since we haven't talked about these yet. Our rear cross members can really go wherever you like. We've got an assortment of holes here. They are staggered, so it'll go in first and third, or however you do it, the way it lines up. You can put them with the RCeveryday name up or down, smooth on the other side, in case you don't want the branding on your truck. I get that. We're using M3 by 8s again, and we're just going to start on one side. I'm going to put a set of them, or one of them here at the very back. I'll go ahead and mount both of these to one side. Any of these holes also will work as your shock mount. If you want to have your shock angled forward, angled up. Another thing we are adding in the future is going to be a different shock mount. You could run a longer shock or a shorter shock, or whatever it is that you're looking to do. Again, that's why we're not including an axle with this, mainly because of cost. I can't buy 10,000 units of these axles and afford to keep these kits priced right. So whatever axle you've got, that's kind of the gist of the rat rod, is building with what you have. Build it out of whatever spare parts you've got. If you've got an SCX 10 axle that you haven't used in years, if you've got anything, boom racing, RC 4-wheel drive, anything will work as long as it can bolt up with a 4-link and you have some rods and things to make it fit. I'm just gonna kind of get these started by hand. Now these parts are threaded inside. They're printed with threads inside. It will strip out, but they are made to thread straight into. Go ahead and get our other two in. Again, I recommend doing this by hand. I'm cheating because I've been doing this all day. So now our chassis are self-sufficient. They're standing up on their own. We're going to move on to the motor and trans plate. So we have 3 holes here on the side. We got 3 holes here on this bracket. You can do any configuration with this you want. If you want to move them forward, you can do that. If you want to keep all 3 lined up, which is what I'd recommend, and everything lines up nice. It all depends about your front length and where you want to mount your rod as to where the screws actually go here. So what I'm doing here, I'm putting 1 screw in the back hole of the front mount. This is again a M3 by 8. And then we've got our 2 back here for the transmission crossmember. Just getting them nice and snug, not trying to torque them to meet Jesus or anything. Now our motor and transmission is held in place. So that leaves us 2 options for mounting our front suspension links. For the front axles, I'm using Tamiya semi-truck 1/14 scale axles. You can use like this one here. This is just the stock one. I think this is actually an Integy brand. They're like $12 to $18 on Amazon or eBay. Good budget piece. It comes with the steering link, everything ready to go. The one we're going to put on this truck, which is what I like to use, these are custom ones that are on eBay. I'll put a link below to that. These are about 50 bucks, but they do give you a drop. So if you're running a very tall tire, the drop axle will come in handy. If you're using a short tire, then this will work a lot better for you. So the next step is to install the front cross member, and I left this for last because there's a trick to this. So these front axles have a certain width, and the way they mount, I'll show you here, we have these 2 blocks here. This is where they bolt on the Tamiya semi-truck to the leaf springs. So that is your standard width, like your TF2s, everything with leaf springs is about that wide. And if you look at this, it's just barely wider than the axle. So this front cross member is actually tapered in, and it's going to narrow the front of the chassis so that your suspension arms will clear these screws sticking out of here. It's actually going to pull the front of the chassis in. And this, again, M3x8. You could work with 6. You might could fit a 10 in there. But M3x8 is pretty much the basic from this kit. Everything is M3x8. So it's just going to be 4 screws in here. You can see if we put it over to one side, it's off kilter. There's about a 4 millimeter gap. So that's how much we're going to pull these frame rails in the middle and narrow it in a little bit. So I'm going to get that started by hand. And again, I know I keep sounding like a broken record. Don't use power tools on 3D printed parts. Just been doing this all day, so I'm tired of hand cranking. I'm actually putting 6s in the front and 8s in the back hole because that's all I had handy at the moment. We'll just snug them up, and we'll do the other side, and it will pull the frame rails together and give us the space we need for our front suspension. All right, so now you can see, maybe you can see that the front narrows in from this cross member to this cross member. And that's what's good about this steel being mild steel. It's workable, it's bendable, it's pliable. You can do different things with it. If you've got a totally different axle, you make your own axle, whatever you want to do. So that wraps up the basic assembly of just what comes in the kit. Now we're going to move forward to mounting the axles and things the way I do it, and the rest of that's kind of up to you, depending on what kind of axle you have. I mean, the rear is going to mount with the standard 4-link, so any crawler you've got, if you've got an original SCX10 sitting around missing pieces that you've robbed off of it for years, throw that axle under it. The front axles are kind of specific. It needs to be a semi-truck axle, to be a straight axle look, or you can make your own. And if you're really creative, you can throw a solid drive axle out there and figure out how to make it actually drive. I'm not sure. I haven't tried it because I don't do 4-wheel drive rat rods. I've never built one. I'm not sure if you had like an LRT2 GCM transmission or something, if that would clear our mount or not back here. I don't believe it would. But, I mean, traditionally rat rods are 2-wheel drive. They're low. They're ratty. So that's the build we're going for. That's what we're doing with this. So I'm going to start with this drop axle. See, it has 2 threaded holes here. And what I do, these are M3 rod end screws. The longer, the better, because this is also going to double as your shock mount. So it's got the end there for the 1.5 mil. I'm going to thread that in. Where's my other long one at? I've already lost it. Oh, there it is. So there's different rod choices. Everything depends on the look you're going for. I'm just trying to make this jive and work right to get the proportions right where the shocks line up. Again, you can cut these down if you need to, or you can throw spacers on there if you need to, depending on what kind of shocks you're running. I like these new RC 4-wheel drive Bilstein shocks. They are kind of expensive. These are, let me find out which size I have. These are 70 mil. I think they have, I don't know if that's where you measure or you measure it from the eyelet to eyelet. Yeah, these are the 60 millimeter and 50 millimeter. Again, that's going to come down to what size tire you're going to use. These are a pretty tall tire. I would probably prefer to have the 50s. I use those on one of my latest builds, and they are awesome on the one I haven't finished yet. So, this is all I have right now. So this is what we're going to run. So we're going to take our long M3 rod end pieces and thread them into the axle. Now there'll be some differences with the axles. This axle, this aftermarket axle, is threaded all the way through. Our knockoff Tamiya semi-axle is only threaded in from one side. So you can't really put a screw through. On these, you could take a really long piece of hardware and just run it straight through and go from there. But this is how I mount the shocks. Put your bottom of it through there. And we're going to run these. These are Sin Racing takeoff links. These are, I know these are going to work perfect for the length of everything we've got going here. These are, come on, about 106, looks like, 106 millimeters. On my original number 2 build, I run these 120 millimeters, which is about the same length, when you add in the shock. So that's kind of what we're doing here. We're adding in the shock. They're a little bit longer, but you get the gist of it. The shock end is about 6 millimeters wide. And then we're going to put our shock onto there and thread this over it. And try to keep it stiff so that most of it goes into the rod. We already have enough of it into the axle. These are kind of directional. I'm actually going to swap these to the RC 4-wheel drive ends because they look cooler. So let me do that real quick. So I like these. These are RC 4-wheel drive's M3 scale heim joints. They look very realistic. They look just like a real heim joint. They do have a little bit of slop in them, but they look way better than things like this. These are the stock Sin Racing ones. But this is how it is. You're using stuff you already got. Whatever rod ends you got will work. Whatever rods you've got, get the length, get the suicide front axle out where you want it. It's all up to you. So you see where that stops in the wrong position. So I always take a screwdriver and we'll just torque it around to get it up and down where we need it. So now our shocks are on. Our axle is ready to go on the chassis. So the key to these front suspensions, it's basically a radius arm setup, but the key to it is tension. It has to have some opposing force to keep it from having slop side to side. If you just bolted this straight on here right now, when you hit your steering, odds are this would wiggle back and forth. So the key is to put a little tension in those arms and pull them apart. So it kind of adds some triangulation to the whole front suspension setup. So what I've got here is some 2 mil spacers, M3 hardware. I think in the instructions I put 16 millimeter. You've got a lot of room in there, but you have to go through your rod end and your 2 mil spacer and the frame rail into the plastic. So it's kind of up to you what you use, but you've got a little wiggle room. You can go a little longer, you can go a little shorter. Trying to keep it like that with everything so that there is no, you got a little room, not make any mistakes and damage anything. So you see that's going to give us about 6 millimeters of bite into the actual plastic. So I'm going to run that one in. Snug it up. It's a little tricky getting these in here sometimes. That's why you have to have your rods perfectly up and down, perfectly vertical. So you see I'm prying it away from the body and trying to get this spacer in here. Might use some pliers for this, and I'll fish the bolt through. You can also use scale hardware. I really wish I had done that before I started, because this one might actually stay together this time, because I do want to actually build a whole car with my kit here. So we can make sure it's in the same hole into the plastic, and we're good to go. We'll put him in, snug him up. So now our front suspension is hung. So now you see why we tapered in the front of the chassis. So our axle can move freely without interfering with those screws holding our radiator and our grill in. So again, our shock mounts, same story, M3x8s. Depending on where your front axle lands, front to back, you can add spacers in here. It will clear these shocks. The other one I built earlier had I needed a 2 mil spacer in there. Again, we are going into threaded plastic. So these are a 1.7 super wide RC 4-wheel drive semi tire on a 1.9 wheel, and that's going to give us just barely any ride height, which is right where I like it, with these 60 mil shocks. Yeah. So once we get the rear suspension on, it's going to be nice and low. We'll have, typically in my videos, I measure the ride height. I'll lay these down and it'll be flat on the ground like so, and that'll be the ride height where the chassis sits on top of the black part. So it's usually about 4 or 5 millimeter, sometimes 6, but now we have front suspension. It's going to give us a little more motion than we actually need. But if we put a taller tire on here, we can raise the whole car up. It's all about proportions with this stuff. So it depends on the look you're going for, what kind of tire and wheel you pair with the body that you've got, with the stretch of the car. Yeah, there's a lot of fine tuning that can be done, but it's all just kind of cosmetic stuff. So for the rear suspension, it's completely up to you. I've got a Yoda 2 axle. I like the RC 4-wheel drive stuff. I've always been a fanboy. So that's what I run. The upper links are triangulated. The rears are parallel. We've got angled rod ends here on both the upper links because you really have to have them at this length. And this is probably one of the longer of the 4 links that I've made for rat rods. Typically I'll use the rod ends and like 40mm rods, keep things nice and tight, but this truck was one of my first builds, the number 2, so it's a little bit longer. I think these are, let me measure them real quick and I'll tell you. Also, these rod ends and stuff, if you go through my Amazon store link in the video description box, you can buy M3 rods on Amazon, and they're quite a bit cheaper than buying any brand name stuff. So these are 60 mils for the bottom. The tops have a spacer in them as well. So we are at, those are at 46. So they're 40s with 6mm spacers with the angled RC4 drive plastic rod ends, because they don't really make they don't have these M3 heim joints that are angled. They're just the straight ones only. So for your upper links, you pretty much have to use the plastic ones, or you can use your axial ones or whatever. The only concern you have with that on the rear is your pinion angle, because your transmission is down on the ground pretty much. It's just 5 or 6 millimeters off the ground. So you don't want your axle pointed up. You don't want it pointed too far down. You want it kind of even. This has already been done to line it up. There's a million options here with the chassis as to where you mount it. The shock, I don't even have shocks on this yet because I don't have any more shocks at the time of filming this, so we're not going to get that far in this one, but we'll have it mocked up and rolling. So let me throw this thing on here real quick and we'll talk more about the angle. All right, so let's talk about geometry. It's the only math related class I was decent at in school. Your chassis rails on your TF2s and things like that are roughly 60 mils in between. And that's what we have going on here. So now at the back of this, we're right at 60 millimeters. I've got my outer links bolted down here with some, I think, 5mm spacers on the outside to bring them out a little bit. That moving them outward will actually bring the bottom of the axle down and bring your pinion angle down. You do not have to use rods in here. I like to. The more stuff you add to it, the more rigid the frame. So our upper links here, I've mounted on the second hole down on our 4-5 hole range here. Our bottom links here are on the very back hole. You could change that. You could leave them here and you could run longer rods here and go all the way to the front. It's going to give you a little bit different movement of your pinion as it goes up and down. This is working out pretty good because we're not thinking in crawler terms. We're not going to have flex. We're not going to have a ridiculous amount of articulation. I mean, this will articulate. That's about it. We've got about 2 inches of actual flex out of this rear suspension. But if you run a longer bottom rod, you might get a little more. It may affect the pinion better, maybe worse. I don't know. It's just things you have to play with. But this is why this is so much fun for me to do, because this is the kind of stuff I geek out on. It's engineering. It's just working with it. If you've got an SCX10 axle under here, you're going to have a totally different setup because of the way that it is. You can tell because of the way that it is. But your mount and stuff will be different, but it's still going to bolt to the chassis the same. It just depends where you put it as to how it all works, how it articulates, and how your pinion angle is affected. So again, you don't have to have rods in here. You could throw nuts on the inside of this on these screws and call it good, because we already have enough cross members on this chassis to add plenty of rigidity to make it work and stay together. I like to add as much as possible. This section here is actually a little bit shorter than this one. I could feel it as I was tightening it up. It pulled the chassis rails in. And anywhere you can add some tension to the chassis rails, it's going to add stiffness. It's going to make it more rigid, and it's going to make it perform better. And you look at race cars, they put full cages, tube cages to the entire thing, tying the front suspension to the roll bar to the front cage and around the motor and everything. It makes it more rigid. If you're driving it on the road every day on the highway, it'd be a nightmare. It'd bounce and shake and rattle and sound terrible. But for racing applications, you want your chassis stiff. And yeah, I sound like I built race cars. I build rat rods. But this is all jiving and working nice. But again, you don't have to have this. I think this is, that's 60 millimeters. Right here, we are at 59. So we have an RC four-wheel drive rod that is a 40, and I've got the rod ends plus, what is that? It looks like a 3 or 4 mil spacer on each side. So it comes out 1 millimeter less. So we're creating tension here, which is going to stiffen the whole chassis, which is a great place to have extra tension on the chassis by your suspension mounts. So if you're going to do the rear shocks, 50, 40 millimeter With this, I would honestly mount them to the same bolt as our lower 4-link mount, because you want it as low as possible. If you put a shock, I don't have any spare shocks at the moment. Everything is claimed for, but we want it to set about there is level. A little bit of rake, look cool. So I think a 50 mil shock from that bottom hole to one of these holes in here, perfect. 60 mil shock, you could bring it forward to this cross member. You can move those cross members around where you need them. And I know we're going to be working on it. Me and 110 Rod Shop are still talking about things to add to this in the future. So we'll probably have another cross member. We'd already drawn one up before a couple years ago that was just like this, but it had a shock mount that stuck up over the top of the frame rail, so you could get a little bit taller shock in there if you wanted to. But with this design, the way the cab sits, this is basically the top of your bed. If you put a truck bed on this, that would be where the top of it is, at the top of the chassis rail. And that way, when you look in the bed of the truck, it's all suspension, it's all engineering, it's all rusty metal and cool looking 3D printed stuff. So that's pretty much the basics of building the kit. Again, I would love to provide everything for you and have the transmission, the motor, the axles with the kit, all the hardware. It's just not feasible. I mean, once you get into this stuff, guys, the cost of it to do what these big companies do, you're looking at at least a few thousand units, and you're talking millions of dollars to be able to buy all this stuff, put it together, packaging, everything, not even including marketing or anything like that. It's just sheer cost of production, and you know, everything's expensive. So that's why we're trying to do it this way, trying to keep it affordable, trying to let you use stuff you already have. If you got a spare axle laying around, you got links, you got hardware. I mean, if you're like me, this is all M3 hardware. I have a whole bin of this of M2 hardware, 2.5 hardware. I've got hardware out the wazoo. A lot of you guys that have been doing RC stuff, especially crawlers for years, you're going to have most of the stuff you need for this kit. So any axle you want to use in the rear, anything you got, it doesn't have to be, it could be something obscure. As long as it has a 4-link, you can mount it up. The possibilities are endless. You could even probably configure this to work with a leaf spring setup if you really wanted to. You could do anything you want. And that's what I'm trying to drive here, is to make the creativity on your end. I'm just providing the stuff that's difficult, because I've been doing this for, what, 7 years now, since we started building the rat rods almost. And the main thing that people ask me all the time to do for them is make them a chassis. And like, you can't make a chassis without the body and the tires and the wheels and knowing what your end goal is, at least a rough idea of it when you get started, because it's all proportionate. So I've tried to minimize the fabrication side of it and get it to where it's actual building, just for you guys, that you can build it and do what you need to do. So the chassis, having chassis made and stuff, that's pretty simple. That front cross member is, honestly, it's genius. I didn't come up with it on my own. Me and 110 Rod Shop, Dustin, worked on that, and we both understood the assignment. It needed to solve a lot of problems. And if you've watched any of my rat rod builds, servo steering is always a problem. It's usually the last thing I get figured out. It's always an eyesore. Using full-size servos is just ugly. Linkage and stuff is tricky. And that's what we need to talk about next, is the steering linkage. It's super simple in this. So all of these axles, even the stock Tamiya semi-truck axle, have a long side and a short side. This one is built backwards. This is how they come when you buy them cheap on Amazon. It needs to be on the back side like it is here. All you got to do, this small servo horn, drill it out, M3, hardware and a nut, and make a link. Goes from here to here. On this back corner, your front is connected by the drag link in the front. Easy. You need 2 rod ends and a rod. Assortment of spacers to kind of make it fit right, and you just dial your trims in and you're good to go. Super simple solution. That is one of the most difficult things to solve with the rat rod problem, is the steering. And I know everybody that watched the videos wants to see a link come out of the cowl of the body and stuff. We're not there yet. It's been done. It can be done, but it's sloppy. And that's the main problem I've had with it. When you have an arm the full length of the front of the chassis, it's got a lot of play in it. The longer your linkage, the more slop you're going to have. So having it right here where it just goes horizontal with your drag link, it's nice and tidy. And those Reefs Micro 99s work perfect. They have plenty of torque for this type situation. Back here in the middle of the chassis, the one flaw, I think, the only flaw really with the R4 transmission, is that one screw mount that hangs down on the bottom. So this is all designed, that stays nice and tucked up. It's level with the bottom of the chassis. So if you're like me and you want it just a couple millimeters off the ground, you won't drag that bolt off of your transmission. This cross member here hangs down 1 millimeter below the chassis rail. So if you do bottom out, that's going to catch stuff. It's not going to, scratch your frame if you want to paint it. So you don't have to worry about that. And that'll give you a place to wear and let you know, what's going on down there when you're driving it. We've got plenty of room up here. Again, like I said, if you wanted to put some big diesel engine in here, or 12 valve Cummins, or whatever 3D printed option you got. The only thing we didn't provide holes for is the RC 4-wheel drive scale V8. Like I mentioned before, you will not use the motor plate with that. You might be able to, but you'd have to modify mounts and do a bunch of stuff. But if that's your cup of tea, more power to you. That's what I've been doing for 6 years, is making everything work the way I wanted it to. But those have their own mount here in the middle of the engine, and you'd have to drill some holes for that. And I've covered that in plenty of rat rod videos. You take the chassis rails completely apart, and you clamp them together. You bolt through common holes and make sure they do not move. You put them in a drill press, and once you've got a location where you need to drill, and you drill straight through both holes, both chassis rails at the same time, they're mirror image, and then you build it the way you want to build it. And we're not doing, so I've only got 50 kits to start with. That's all we can afford. That's it. So we're doing 50 kits the first run. I'm hoping we can get a second run and do a little bit more. We're not going to have 50 bodies ready to go. Obviously, these take more to print, but we do have officially licensed Awesome Designs #2 rat rod cabs available. And these are, again, are SLS printed, nylon infused, super. I mean, look how much I'm squeezing it. And this thing is just durable. Not going to melt in the sun. This is designed to fit directly over this chassis. The back slides in between very snugly. So I hope this helps you put yours together. I appreciate your purchase. You're making my dreams come true here, trying to make a living doing RC stuff and not have to slave away at a factory like I did for so long. I'm doing something I love, and I'm trying to share ideas and creativity with all of you, and hoping this helps make it a little easier to get more of you into it, get your minds thinking, get you being creative and seeing what y'all come up with. That's been the funnest part of this rat rod journey, is since people have started trying to build their own and doing stuff, seeing everybody else's vision of it. So it's cool for me to be able to offer you a product to help get you started in it, because I know there's a lot of people out there that wanted to build them that couldn't get past this step. And now I've got something that can help you with that. And I can't wait to see what y'all build. I'm pretty excited about all this. It's been a dream finally come true. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I've been wanting to make this video for about 4 years now. And I hope I explained it well. If you're familiar with the channel and you've talked to me before, you know I'm always willing to answer questions and help any way I can. So if you're having any trouble with your kit, send me a message on Facebook or Instagram, and I'm happy. I'll get back with you as soon as I can, and I'm happy to help and answer any questions. I think I covered everything pretty good in this video, but you know how it is. Everybody's got a different way of thinking, a different understanding of things. So if something didn't make sense, reach out. I'm happy to help. Keep it scale, guys. Check out RCeveryday.com, because I don't know when this video's out and what I have available. So these may be available now. They may already be sold out. We may be on round 2. Who knows? Who knows what the future holds? But get out there and do something fun with the hobby. Whether you're just crawling, whether you're bashing, whether you're building rat rods. I appreciate y'all for watching. Keep it scale, and I'll see you in the next one.